The world's most iconic watches are unsurprisingly expensive, and so for those who don't know their transoms from their passerelles, who think the main salon is where they get their haircut, an affordable alternative is just what the accountant ordered. So today I'm going to talk to you about 5 of the most iconic watches in existence, how they got their legendary status, and give you a few affordable alternatives to tickle your fancy with. The last one comes right after the one before. A lot has been said about Rolex's Submariner being the blueprint for the modern dive watch, but I think a lot of that sentiment is lost to the ears of a contemporary audience, because the idea of a mechanical watch being anything close to modern is simply ridiculous. Today's advancement in technology seems to exist on a more nebulous level, with microchips that can fit more data and software that can predict the number of fingers on a typical human hand to within a margin of 5. None of it really makes sense to the average human brain, because the lizard people masquerading as humans developing this stuff are simply far more advanced than we are. Whilst they're busy progressing AI into a new generation of mass media hysteria, we're busy contemplating whether or not socks are handed. Or footed, even. In the 1900s, at least the earlier parts of it, technological growth existed in a way that made intuitive sense. When automatic watches existed and chronograph watches existed, it was logically reasonable that the next technological development would be an automatic chronograph. And when diving equipment became better and allowed divers to roam down where it's wetter, the next generation of waterproof watches was sure to follow. Take it from me. Even the principles required to achieve this make sense. The first water-resistant watch Rolex made, no, not the Oyster, the Submarine, housed a complete watch inside an outer container sealed with a compression thread. You know how the jam won't come out of the jam jar until the lid has been bravely and expertly removed? Well, any jam on the outside wouldn't be able to get in either. The Rolex Oyster that came after, which went on to become the Submariner, was an evolved version of that same principle, just with more jam jar lids. One on the front, one on the back, and one on the side as the crown. It's a technology, if you can even call a screw thread a technology, that had been demonstrated to keep water out of a watch since the 1850s, when it was presented as part of a world of tomorrow look into the future as a functional concept by watchmakers W. Pettit & Co. This was worked up into production by British case manufacturer Denison, who would become a supplier to a then British-based Rolex, and developed in miniature for the crown by Fitch, who based it on a previous iteration of a screw-down crown cap. Add a high-contrast luminous dial, a timing bezel developed on the Rolex Zerograph, based on an idea from Longines, and you've got a Submariner. It's not a watch, it's a collection of ideas gathered over a century, all brought together for the first time in one place. Even in the 1950s, Rolex understood the plight of the common man, because even though the Submariner wasn't a watch you had to become intimate with your local shopkeep to get back then, it was still priced with a reasonable premium above its competition. The answer? Sell virtually the same watch with a different name for a cheaper price, kind of like how Audi does with Volkswagen. Vorsprung de TikTok. That's what Rolex did with the Tudor Submariner literally from day one. Tudor already had the Prince collection, based on the water-resistant Oyster, and so when the Rolex Submariner was unleashed upon the world in 1954, Tudor was right there with it hoovering up the crumbs. 2 wallets, 1 watch. Of course, the Tudor did sacrifice on specification in some respects, but then, as it is now, it's not by as much as you might perhaps think. If we compare the modern £8,050 Rolex Submariner's caliber 3230 to the £3,910 Tudor Black Bay's caliber MT5602U, the Tudor's hardly goes lacking. Both are good for about 3 days before kicking the mainspring barrel. Both offer chronometer certified accuracy, and both are variously anti-magnetic, with the Tudor's silicon balance spring the technically better option over Rolex's metal alloy. And as for that famous water resistance, expanded from 100 meters all the way up to 300 meters over the Submariner's 3/4 century existence, that difference is split by Tudor's 200 meter capability, which is fine. If you're someone who values the benefit of 18-way seats over pedestrian 14-way, then perhaps the 100 meter deficit might be an issue. Or you're a squid. It may no longer carry the hallowed name Submariner, but the Tudor Black Bay is now as it ever was, the same watch with a different badge and budget. Aside from a little bit of slick ceramic trim, the Rolex edition of this seminal dive watch is little more than Daddy Bear's porridge by comparison. And if that's still a bit too sweet. The fundamental principle of Rolex's Submariner isn't really something that can be patented, at least not anymore. Once upon a time, when the possession of a screw thread could have a person burned as a witch, sure. But these days it's such an elemental concept that not even Apple would try and claim it. In fact, you may have already left an irate comment to tell me the Blancpain 50 Fathoms came first, but actually that watch did without a screw-down crown because the patent was owned by Rolex. These days the 5-pointed crown has no such sway over that particular feature, and so any dive watch worth its water resistance is destined to have one. One such watch is Tissot Seastar, and on paper it's actually putting the Rolex to shame. The Powermatic 80 caliber has 10 extra hours of power reserve, enough to cope with the extended editions of The Lord of the Rings, and it'll join the Submariner as they leave the Tudor stranded at 200 meters down to the full 1,000 feet. For £685, you could buy 11 Seastars for the Rolex's budget and still have enough left over for a taxi home. And actually, the Seastar has a date as well, which costs even more on the Rolex. The difference really is in the bits that shine and sparkle, and of course that James Cameron didn't go all the way to the bottom of the sea for a Tissot. Our next iconic addition is an exploration as much into the success of French elegance as it is into watchmaking, a combination that's been waging a war for the better part of half a millennium. Despite 1666 being the year of both the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London, where victims of both ironically died burning up, reigning monarch King Charles II was more preoccupied with the way his courtiers dressed. They were on fleek in the latest Parisian streetwear, le supreme as it were, which King Charlie said made them look like magpies, so he knocked out the three-piece suit and ordered even, everyone to wear it, with no one donned in foreign muck to appear in his presence. This, if you recall, was how the pocket watch came to be. And who took the watch out of the pocket and put it onto the wrist? A French jeweller by the name of Louis Cartier. His creation, which would later become known as the Santos, was not the first watch worn on the wrist, but it was the one that began the transition in trend amongst men. His follow-up, the Tank, sealed the deal. Because women didn't wear waistcoats, they wore watches on their wrists as bracelets instead, which men thought was super lame. So the best way for Cartier to persuade men that wearing a wristwatch wouldn't give them cooties was to make it look like a gun. A gun you can drive. A tank. It was the Cartier Tank. The Tank has since become one of the most steadfast watch designs in the industry's back catalogue, never wavering in its timelessness since it first roared into life in 1917. It defies everything people choose to pay money for today. Roman numerals, a rectangular case and a smaller size horological Novichok for any other watch brand. And yet it remains the foundation of the second biggest luxury watchmaker in the world. What we know as the Tank these days is actually an evolution of the original, modified in 1920 into the more elegant shape we see today in the Tank Louis Cartier and the Tank Must. The Francais remains closest to the original as a constant reminder that the French eventually got revenge on King Charles II. And despite an upper end on the Tank collection costing in excess of £100,000, a starting price of £3,150 makes it surprisingly accessible. But we can do better. If you yearn for the misogynistic ice cream ads of the 1990s, then the Longines Dolcevita will give you some of that by name at least, one that draws from the Italian for the good life. When I think of the good life, what comes to mind is a summer's day with the curtains shut and a no-hit run of the blood-starved beast, but I'm not sure that's what Longines had in mind. Instead, I'm picturing mountainside roads alongside the south coast of France, silk scarf blowing, knowing the difference between a transom and a passerelle, and I think Longines is too for its half-price Tank equivalent. Like the affordable end of the Cartier Tank collection, the £1,400 Dolcevita gets its power from a battery, and also like the affordable end of the Cartier Tank collection, the Dolcevita is available in some eye-popping colours. If the old-fashioned ensemble of off-white dials set with black Roman numerals is a little too tenor men for you, then the monochrome sub-collection of the Dolcevita might be more what you're looking for. Where the Cartier's colours are muted and regal, the monochrome has the vibrance of a banned kids' fruit-themed drink, including everyone's favourite flavour, blue. With the dial markers as absent as an inner-city father, the monochrome feels like the most contemporary iteration of the famous rectangular shape, even including a matching croc print strap that may well get you VIP access to Coachella. If £1,500 is still more than you'd like to pay for your Tank Light, then let me introduce you to affordable Swiss watchmaker Frederique Constant's classic Carree in small seconds configuration. At £795, I haven't seen a tank this cheap since the invasion of Ukraine. As the classic name suggests, the Carree is fit to bursting with old-fashioned details like those numbers scribed in Latin. However, it's decidedly different from the Cartier in one distinctive way. Those who sit all the way to the end of the movie credits will be familiar enough with Roman numerals to recognise the number 4, an I before a V indicating 5-1, aka 4. Cartier owners get a very different experience, however, with the 4 o'clock slot filled instead with a watchmaker's 4. In symmetry with the number 8 opposite, the gap left by the twin digits of a standard 4 are replaced with a row of I's, continuing the trend of 1, 2 and 3 before it. Unsurprisingly in quartz and shrouded in steel, the affordable Freddy C is an Art Deco flashback that'll have you dancing the Charleston with much more cash left in your pockets. It's not the one and only original Cartier, but it's also a whole lot cheaper. Unless you buy the gem set version, which will take you right back up to the price of the Cartier. A big thank you goes out to all my Patreons, without whom the channel would not be able to exist. If you want to join them for some extra watch chat, you'll find the link in the description below. Thank you. Now to something even more obnoxious, because there are few watches as in your face as the original 1972 Audemars Piguet Royal Oak. Outpricing and underperforming everything else available, including other Audemars Piguet watches, it was the horological equivalent of bringing your own chef to a Michelin star restaurant, and one you just plucked from an Arby's. The sole purpose of the Royal Oak, in the face of Audemars Piguet's total obliteration, was to be bought just for being expensive. It cost 10 times the price of a Rolex Submariner, and more even than Audemars Piguet's own gold complications. It was a hell of a gamble, one that paid off in no small part because of a single nation, Italy. Who would have guessed the home of Lamborghini would be responsible for making a watch as shouty as its residents successful? Funnily enough, it only took off in Italy when Audemars Piguet offered it in gold. It was and is the brand's most successful watch, ever. So much so that brand MD Georges Gaulet was asked by the media in 1982 about the impact of the Royal Oak on brand image. "We do not want our name to be projected to the public only through this star model," was his reply. Foreshadowing. You could realistically say the Royal Oak, with its low poly case and fake news screws, is one of the most influential watches of all time. It wasn't the first with an integrated bracelet. The Rolex Beta 21 Quartz 5100 came out a few years earlier, but it was the one that made owning a mechanical watch cool again, ultimately saving tens of thousands of Swiss jobs. Could you say Audemars Piguet has fallen foul of the threat brushed off by Georges Gaulet in 1982? Does Spider-Man shit in a watch? It's the impossible success that is the one-hit wonder that dwarfs all other previous efforts. Which is to say that, yes, Audemars Piguet is now the butthole surface of watchmaking. To continue the musical theme, the Royal Oak's Despacito effect saw the horological reggaeton spread far and wide, with other watchmakers rushing to dip their biscuit in the gravy train. Nivada Grenchen's F77 is the rebirth of such a watch, created then for the same reason as it was recreated now, to get some of that sweet, easy green. You'll notice two things about the F77. One, it was first released in 1976. Yes, before it was renamed the F77 in 1977, it carried the powerful name Mustang 76. 2. It couldn't look more like a Royal Oak if Georges Gaulet made empty promises about it. It has an octagonal case clamped by slotted hexagonal bolts held on with an integrated bracelet. Dial-wise, it differs at least, pinching Zenith's hand and marker set from the El Primero Chronomaster, complete with the thick black line splitting the bare metal. Fun fact, Rolex borrowed this hand style in 1988 alongside the El Primero Caliber for the revival of the much maligned Daytona. Okay, so I lied about the fun part. From £850 for the bare bones steel no date, up to £1,450 in titanium with a fancy stone or meteorite dial, the Nivada F77 offers an authentically sized 37mm experience, almost identical to the original. Which original do I mean? The Nivada or the Audemars Piguet? Yes. But if you want to spend less and get more, at least by way of originality, then cast your eyes to the Maen Manhattan 37, a £570 integrated alternative that's at least copying a different watch. This time we're sourcing our shape from a Vacheron Constantin, albeit one from the 70s that still aped the Audemars Piguet. So we're basically doing the same thing with extra steps. Few will recognise the more rectangular shape of the Manhattan 37, however, since the Vacheron on which it's based was as well received as a FedEx parcel. What's more likely is owners being mistakenly believed to have been gifted it at a rooftop party. You never actually own a Cubitus, you merely hide it in a drawer until you're allocated a Nautilus. No such issue with the Manhattan 37, which, as the name suggests, is a 37mm slice of beautiful metal bread. In the wake of rectangular watch fever, it's refreshing to see one that's actually nicely proportioned. The Geneva stripe dial is an unusual but interesting touch, and it's nice to see a mid-case profile that actually matches the bezel, unlike the Cubitus, which went full John Krasinski. Available with or without the date, in a variety of colours, and even in an ultra-thin manually wound 39mm edition less than 7mm thick, the Maen Manhattan is bringing vintage integrated vibes for a budget that's suitably rose-tinted. The only thing it doesn't have is a lot of professionals around it to tell it will work. If the Submariner was the archetypal dive watch, then the Patek Philippe Calatrava is the wink in the watchmaker's eye, the first draft for the luxury wristwatch as we know it today. By modern standards, the circumstances surrounding the Calatrava's origins would raise online outrage, and there would almost definitely be a screw-down crown article about it. The reason for that is twofold. First, because the languishing maker of complex pocket watches had been bought out by its dial supplier, whose owner instructed his punk kid's son at the age of just 21 to make Patek cool. Pocket watches were uncool. Wristwatches were cool. So young Henri Stern, without any prior design experience, took it upon himself to reinvent Patek Philippe. History has a funny way of repeating itself. And second, because they called that watch Calatrava. The Calatrava cross, the symbol of Patek Philippe, had been registered since 1887, but was otherwise unused until the 1960s. According to Patek Philippe today, the Calatrava cross is a superb symbol for superb watches, a hallmark of gallantry and independence. The reality is the Calatrava cross is the symbol of the Order of Calatrava, so named after the Islamic castle borrowed by the order as part of a reconditioning of the Muslim people to Christianity. That reconditioning may or may not have incorporated just a smidgen of violence and death. The truth is, Jean-Adrien Philippe saw the logo and thought it was cool, not really knowing any better. And there just may be a watch brand in 100 years' time that comes across a funny-looking square logo with a cross in it and thinks that looks cool too. And so the watch, perhaps a hallmark of gallantry and independence, or maybe the forced conversion of Patek Philippe to a new world order, set the scene for every premium wristwatch yet to come. It's round, it's luxurious, and it slips mighty fine under a cuff, unlike other Patek Philippe watches I can think of. Saving yourself the many tens of thousands and perhaps a little discomfort now you know the logo's origin story is the Raymond Weil Millesime Small Seconds, a modern interpretation of those early wristwatches for around £1,800. Millesime is as Millesime does because the name directly translates to vintage, which is broadly the era on which this watch is based. The past. Not the recent past, but the while ago past. It actually expands into a subset of Calatrava watches, and indeed wristwatches in general, that are collectively known as sector dials, because the dials are divided into quadrants, or sectors if you will. This reportedly aided easier reading of the wristwatch, although that seems unlikely because, well, look at it. You have eyes. You tell me how those two lines take you from time-telling uncertainty to atomic clock accuracy. What's more likely is that wristwatch manufacturers added it as an indication of its precision, placing the ability of its watches under the literal crosshair, shooting time in the face, perhaps. Our Raymond wheel Millesime benefits from this same addition, breaking up the dial into ideal birthday cake portions. Otherwise, it's delicately simple, defining the segmenting rings tracking hours, minutes, seconds, and even beats, with different light-catching finishes. At just under 40mm and containing a sub-second soliter, the Millesime manages for the first time in a long time to create a Raymond wheel that people might actually buy, you know, on purpose. Not only does it offer up a very convincing slice of colonial crusade cosplay, it's also a stark reminder that a brand can be made, or broken, with a single watch. The great advantage of the simplest dress watches is you can get a surprisingly long way with not very much, because most of the cost, like the state of Texas, is spent on execution. If you're fine with a few less than perfect finishes, even £450 can get you a long way down the road to Calatrava. Take the Baltic MR Classic, for example, a beautifully balanced and exquisitely subtle dress watch that packs a whole heap of surprises into a case just 36mm across. The last time this much was found crammed into such a small space was Operation Global Chain. Applied, polished Breguet numerals hover over a textured dial in blue, black, silver, or salmon, with the 7 and 8 AWOL in place of an asymmetric second subdial. You know, like a jaune, but minus the blood orgies. But as with a case of kyphosis, it's around back when things get serious. Yes, that's a micro-rotor movement, just like a Calatrava, except here it doesn't cost as much as a motorhome. Its Chinese origin and modest finish keep it reasonably priced. But when other watches this price use a closed caseback to hide a battery, I don't think anyone's complaining. Thinking outside of the box is, these days, an idiom often used by middle management at big businesses in lieu of an actual brief. However, in the heady days of the 1950s, when anything was possible, there really was opportunity to be had in looking at a project in a different way. What's not so well realised today is that the chronograph wasn't as much of a feature in the common wristwatch back then as it is now. We've come to underappreciate just how intricate this particular complication is because the 1970s Valjoux 7750 made it affordable at a mass-produced level. Until then, you were more likely to see a juggling cat than someone wearing a chronograph. Those that needed to time things used a stopwatch instead. Chronograph watches existed, but in small numbers. Brands like Rolex included them in the catalogue simply to fill up the back pages. Customers didn't want them, and watchmakers didn't want to go to the hassle of making them. It was one of the last of the great complications left that hadn't been properly adapted from the pocket watch. But Omega had the bit between its teeth because the rapid advancement of sports watches had caught it off guard. Its 1948 Seamaster was as waterproof as a marshmallow canoe, and it had been utterly humiliated by the shock release of the far more capable Rolex Submariner. Rolex followed up with the Milgauss and the GMT Master, professional watches for professional people, but the relatively young brand had an Achilles heel. Most of its hot new releases revolved around simple, but patented, features. The chronograph was just too much for young Rolex to contend with, and so it became the focal point of Omega's strategic advantage. Their sports watch would be the ultimate sports watch, built for measuring the fastest men in history, race car drivers, followed in a close second by any high schooler whose girlfriend's parents had just left the house. And Omega really thought outside the box for this one, moving the tachymeter bezel from the dial, where it was hard to read and cluttered up the place, to the bezel beyond, from the inside to the outside. This was the beginning of the sports chronograph, and it couldn't have come at a better time, because just a few years later, a rocket hovered 4 inches off the ground for a couple of seconds before settling back down again. That rocket was the Mercury Redstone 1, the first step in the journey to the moon. As the other watches we've seen today did for their categories, the Speedmaster did for its, deciding what a modern mechanical chronograph would look like from there on out. Rolex copied it, Tag Heuer copied it, and today Hamilton has copied it for the Jazzmaster Performer Auto Chrono. Unlike jazz as we ordinarily know it, your partner won't ask you to put something else on, because the straightforward combination of a clear dial with a bezel-mounted tachymeter is a pretty difficult combination to get wrong. Its fortunes have changed since those historic Apollo missions, with sports chronographs rising to the top of pretty much every brand's collection. For £2,135, a third the Speedmaster's price, Hamilton has assembled a well-equipped chronograph for you to time your eggs with. The 42mm case matches the Speedmaster's for size, whilst a power reserve of 60 hours and a water resistance of 100 meters actually outperforms it. The Speedmaster's unspoken dysfunction is that it gets to the end a bit too soon. I suppose the name was a bit of a giveaway. Hamilton actually had the opportunity to provide a chronograph wristwatch for the Apollo 11 moon landing, but because they'd recently had the office redecorated in a thick coat of lead paint, sent a pocket watch instead. Our last lunar alternative is one that was actually worn on the moon, with that very same watch fetching a rather tasty $1.625 million at auction. Whilst the Omega was NASA's official selection, astronauts sometimes wore their own watches in addition, such as Edgar Mitchell's Rolex GMT Master and Dave Scott's prototype Bulova chronograph, which accompanied him on the Apollo 15 mission. Nobody noticed it, of course, because they were all bored of the moon landings by that point and were busy watching Matlock instead. That means if you'd like a recreation of that forgotten Moonwatch, it's yours for just £469, less than a tenth the price of the Omega. There's a choice of 43.5 or 45mm, with the original black dial or a silver and blue colour combo that's not at all borrowing from a dog-based Omega, and a choice of bracelet or straps to keep it secure. Of course, it's quartz, but for that price, anything else would just be out of this world. And remember, if you're looking to make a quick meal, make sure to take your personal watch with you when you next go to the moon. NASA hates this one trick. See you next time.